See, you've all been away all summer. You have plenty of verbal power. Wow, it's really noisy in here. Pleased to welcome new and returning students, faculty and staff to the opening lecture of our fall 2010 lecture series. Tonight's lecturer is Brigitte Shim, Eero Saarinen Visiting Professor in Architecture. Professor Shim is no stranger to Yale. She was the visiting professor in 2001. In fall 2005, she returned as Saarinen Visiting Professor, and in spring 2008 as Davenport Visiting Professor. Brigitte Shim is principal in the Toronto firm Shim-Sutcliffe, founded in 1994, a firm that is internationally admired for its thoroughly conceived, meticulously crafted work. And there are some seats down here, Peter, for the grown-ups, for the late grown-ups. Well, time is slower in there's real time in modernist time. As I was saying, we're internationally known for their meticulously conceived, crafted work. The work of Shim-Sutcliffe is the product of a deep appreciation and understanding of the nature of building sites of functional program, and especially of natural and man-made materials. At a time when many architects de-emphasize issues of materiality and craft, not to mention program and site, in favor of what they presume to be conceptual aspects of architecture, Professor Shim's work is all the more important to the health of the profession. A graduate of the University of Waterloo in Canada, she has been a member of the faculty of the University of Toronto since 1988 and has taught as visiting professor at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne in Switzerland and at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. Brigitte Shim and her partner Howard Sutcliffe have represented Canadian design in international exhibitions, and their built work has been published widely in North and South America, Europe, and Asia. Professor Shim currently serves on the board of Build Toronto, Waterfront Toronto's Design Review Committee, the University of Toronto's Design Review Committee, and the editorial board of Praxis, Journal of Building and Writing. In 2007, she served on the Aga Khan Architecture Award Master Jury. After the lecture, please join Professor Shim for a reception at the opening of the exhibition, The Structure of Light, Richard Kelly and the Illumination of Modern Architecture, designed by Dean Sakamoto of our faculty and curated by Dietrich Neumann of Brown University, who was Vincent Scully Professor in our school from 2007 to 2009. Professor Neumann is, or should be in the audience tonight. I haven't seen him, but there he is. He's there. We'll be pleased to meet with you and to meet you at the reception after the lecture. Now let us welcome Brigitte Shim, Eero Saarinen Visiting Professor, to the podium as she delivers the lecture, Remapping My World. Brigitte.
Hello. Can you hear me at the back? Is it good? First of all, thank you, Dean Stern, for your introduction and your invitation to come back to Yale. It's always a pleasure to be here. And I guess over the kind of 4 visits that I've had here, close to a decade, I've really seen this amazing reinvigoration of an already stellar architecture school. And I think that it's the strengthening and deepening of its faculty, the PhD program, The renovation of this landmark building is really a kind of metaphor of transformation, and I think a lot of the credit is due to its wonderful leadership. So I think it's just, as an outsider, to kind of see that from time to time, I just see the kind of, just the strengths emerging. So it's really just a pleasure to be here. For my partner, Howard Sutcliffe, who isn't here, and myself, architecture fuses together both poetic ideas, inert materials, physical site, and social conditions. Architecture trades on its ability to touch and shape people's lives in profound and meaningful ways. Around the world, no matter where it is being practiced, architecture is a complex discipline. I think that for us, as a counterpoint to a kind of growing sameness or placelessness, both Howard and I feel we need to support and celebrate ways of building community that emerges from a deep understanding of local cultures and building traditions, while simultaneously addressing the layered complexities of our modern world. The discipline of architecture needs to nurture alternative models of practice that link and support committed designers to work directly with local communities, to engage in projects that have the capacity to build and transform those communities. These buildings reflect the community's aspirations, and they need to be exemplary architecture of the highest design quality. And I think that that's essential. Perhaps at Yale's architecture school, this is not a new idea, that your school's first-year building project has been the cornerstone of your program for over 40 years. Building buildings and serving community are a kind of joint objective of that program, and I think it's really one of the distinguishing aspects of the school and needs to keep going and to be fostered. The title of my talk is Remapping My World, and in 2007, while serving on the Aga Khan jury, I wrote in an essay after the jury experience that it sort of recalibrated my senses, and that I felt I needed to remap my world, that it had kind of changed my perception of, the geography that I operated in. And so during this talk, what I wanted to do was remap my own work and really sort of reflect upon this question of mapping as a way of recontextualizing where we are, what we do, and why we do it. So in Canada, we're really a small part of what is a big country. And I wanted to use in the talk itself the lens of the Canadian Shield, the Great Lakes, the urban back alleys of Toronto, and the verdant ravine system to really frame or kind of understand the work in a different way. I would say our work, Shim-Sutcliffe's work, is very local. Unlike many of my colleagues in other parts of Canada, we really created a practice where we actually don't get on an airplane to go to a project site unless we can help it. And that by building local, you know a place through its geomorphology, its climate, its cultural history. And in a way, this allows us the luxury of being able to more accurately calibrate the provocation of intensity between the wild and unpredictable forces of nature and the controlled processes of contemporary fabrication. By building local, we can perhaps become a more relevant part of a broader global conversation. So the kind of idea that local isn't a pejorative, but actually a way of actually maybe making a different kind of contribution. So the first map I have, is on, I'm sorry. And it's a kind of situating map because it's actually a map of the British Commonwealth. And everything that's pink is actually the Commonwealth. And in America, it may not be as relevant or as pertinent, but I was actually born in Kingston, Jamaica, somewhere in the Caribbean, and my husband Howard was born in the UK. So I think of us as products of the Commonwealth, and that we both live in Toronto, which is this extremely multicultural city. So in a way, being from somewhere else makes us a citizen of Toronto. And I think that this post-colonial condition has really interesting ramifications at this point of the 21st century because it talks about an inherent complexity and a layered condition. So if you think about a writer like Michael Ondaatje, I don't know if people know his work, but he was born in Sri Lanka, educated in Britain, and lives in Toronto. He wrote a seminal book called In the Skin of the Lion, where he uses two extraordinary pieces of public infrastructure, the R.C. Harris water filtration plant and the Bloor Viaduct, to situate the building of the city as a metaphor. So the idea that an immigrant with this kind of layered background may be more perceptive about Toronto than maybe people that have lived there their whole lives. The kind of maybe other frame for us is the Canadian Shield. And if you think of this sort of the dots here from a kind of textbook map, the shield is described as a stone necklace around Hudson's Bay, a post-glacial landscape, very scarcely populated, thousands of lakes, and containing in effect much of the boreal forest of Canada. The view on the right is a view from the Group of Seven, a group of Canadian painters who would go out into the landscape with little pieces of masonite, actually do their sort of early sketches with the wind blowing in their face, and then go back to their studios and paint these larger canvases. But they were the first group to not try to turn the Canadian landscape into a European one, but to depict the rawness and the kind of the sort of wildness of that landscape. So in this map, I'm showing in effect the range of projects that we've done in the shield. And when we say shield, given its scale, we are really at the bottom end of the shield. So we're sort of like, we're at the point where the shield touches the kind of more genteel agrarian landscape. This project is a dining hall for a camp for inner city kids, but if someone told you this was in Finland, you probably would believe them. So this kind of similarity of the geomorphological structure, the trees is very similar to that kind of circumpolar belt. The project is a very low budget project. It uses off-the-shelf materials, greenhouse glazing, as you can see from this element here, that is used for industrial production greenhouses to provide ventilation as well as light. Using local materials, a kind of articulation of wall and roof and the separation of the two to really create a place for dining 3 meals a day. Using very elemental pieces like 2x4s, which are this kind of whole element here that really acts more as a light monitor. It's not being used structurally. A hybrid structural system combining glulam frames and steel members to really create a kind of hybrid truss. Our engineers we drive our engineers crazy because we love using combinations of steel and wood together. They expand and contract differently. They can't be done on the computer, so we sort of really give them a hard time and they have to work hard for their fees. With the summer camp, this kind of condition of seasonality and the ability to kind of both use these extended elements to create intimate spaces, but also they can close the entire building down within an hour. So this kind of understanding of the seasons and summer and winter is very important in our climatic zone. So here you get these intimate spaces that act as the brise-soleils, but also provide the kind of winter shutdown really quickly. Summer porches that actually extend the building program, which I think is really important given the kind of seasonal dimension of these buildings and the way that it responds to the landscape, using, again, off-the-shelf barn roofing and greenhouse glazing combined with local cedar to really become part of its landscape and yet be distinct from it at the same time. A project we did at the same time, a boathouse, where this kind of, and the studio that I'm doing is this kind of zone of shoreline, wetland water, and I'm really interested in things like the supports. We use these heavy timber cribs and fill them with boulders, so the kind of idea of the underwater infrastructure, the relationship between above and below the waterline are things that interest us and fascinate us. Studies of kind of this question of under and above, so the waterline would actually be about here with things below and above it, and things that are normally hidden get revealed, so we're combining heavy timbers with Douglas fir and using wood in a variety of ways. So trying to understand the kind of tradition of wood construction and tapping into the kind of extremes of both a heavy timber underwater infrastructure, so the underwater being pulled above, and almost a boat building craft tradition, and them being used simultaneously in the same project. So here we're taking a material like the heavy timbers, which are recycled timbers from a demolished building, and using them in a way that is more plastic, where you're reading layers and corners and a kind of level of plasticity that normally doesn't come with the kind of heavy timber material. And again, this kind of love of the hybrid, so we're using wood and steel in kind of different ways and combining and recombining them to create new conditions. And again, this kind of places that are normally dark have light to them, and kind of always trying to play with the kind of vernacular and understand it and yet rethink it at the same time. Indoor spaces that really, indoor spaces that feel more like outdoor spaces, spaces that really are about viewing the landscape or changing your relationship to it. The kind of question of these traditions and how they're reinvented. So a ceiling that feels like the underside of a boat, and the kind of use of different scales of material to really play with your perceptions of these things at the same time. And so we're kind of always driving our contractors crazy. And the kind of idea about how it understands and situates itself in the landscape. Another project, again on the Shield, a small lake in an area called Halliburton, no relationship to the other companies. This was before all that stuff. And the idea that it's almost like a tree house in the kind of forest. And again, here's a whole series of sections where something that's linear has these very varied spatial conditions because of the manipulation. So we're kind of taking this long, skinny thing and slicing it through these sections in a variety of ways. Probably the most important section is this one, where there's a double height space that the whole project revolves around. So it's a double height outdoor space with indoor spaces around it. And a model giving you a sense of that, and the way that you create these conditions where you're inside looking outside, looking inside again. And a very simple plan. And I would say our plans almost appear kind of very understated and simple because our interest is really in the section. And so we try to achieve a level of simplicity in the plan so that we can actually be really exploratory in the sectional and spatial qualities. So here you have a house where you have the kind of structural wall back here, and then you get cantilever upon cantilever. So you get these long overhangs where the soffit becomes a whole other kind of elevation to the building. And then inside, this kind of idea of these penetrations into the landscape, these varied volumes, so these become quite high volumes within a linear experience. And then these folded spaces that where you're sort of folding them and you're inside looking out, looking in again. And again, a very simple material palette, poured in place concrete, Douglas fir, so really reducing the palette. And then here you can see in the landscape this double height space that becomes in effect the pivotal experience that's outside, and then the folding of these interior spaces around it. And the way that it frames views of the landscape, this is in winter, looking out to the lake, and this kind of issue of the shoreline actually being part of the experience. And then from the kind of woods where you're actually again seeing it as almost a kind of pavilion in the forest, and these kind of layers of extension beyond. And then a very recent project where it was part of a kind of grouping of log buildings done in a kind of more traditional log way, and wanting a new building to be part of this ensemble. So here we are looking at a kind of stacked log wall a kind of reflecting pool, a skylight, and really playing with this kind of idea of wood in a different way. So here you're seeing the relationship of the reflecting pool and the kind of entrance. The kind of end of the building where it again shifts scale from almost being miniature to being heroic. So on the right-hand side, you can see the lake and the kind of forest on the left. And then this kind of reflecting pool where you come from the lower level and you come up. The view of the lake from the inside. And the view at night where you get this kind of changing condition. There's a sandblasted glass wall behind the log, so the day to night condition transforms and the house hopefully appears to levitate. The next kind of frame for me and the kind of mapping is the Great Lakes, and it is the largest body of fresh water in the world. So the 5 Great Lakes, if you remember your geography lessons, 20% of the Earth's fresh water. Incredible. And the kind of watershed of the Great Lakes impacts much of North America, of the central portion of the continent. In this kind of textbook view, you can actually see Niagara Falls, which is here. So you can see that this body of water is actually the force that drops over Niagara Falls on a kind of every second. And the depth of Lake Superior is always astounding to me. It's almost like a mountain range underwater. So this kind of, again, this love of underwater, above water condition. So in a way, we've done a few projects, one in the Thousand Islands and 2 on Georgian Bay that I'll share with you. They often refer to the Great Lakes as the third coast. So if you unravel the shoreline, it would be like the Pacific or the Atlantic coast of the continent. So this is a project in the Thousand Islands. You have to take a ferry to get there. And it's called the Island House. Both literally it's on an island, but also metaphorically the kind of idea of the island. This has a green roof, a kind of clover meadow. And the project begins because this is an agrarian landscape. It's a dairy farming island, and many of the dairy farms are being bought up and turned into suburban houses. And this kind of, it begins with a kind of love of this pastoral landscape and wanting to find a way to kind of retain it while changing the use. And so we planted a kind of 5-acre clover meadow as part of the kind of idea of the landscape. And a local farmer comes, cuts it down, and has this agricultural cycle, even though it is no longer kind of a dairy farming piece of land. And the section, again, is always important to us, and the idea that you actually come into the project and there's a reflecting pool that's actually as large as the house, and the idea that the water garden allows you to feel close to the water even though all the regulations and the authorities prevent you from being close to the water. So the irony is anyone with waterfront has to be 66 or 100 feet back from the water line because of all the shoreline issues. So here you can see the reflecting pool, which is close to the kind of size of the habitable interior space. And so when you enter, you actually don't see the water. You actually see the upper portion of a kind of almost a lantern that we've created out of fiberglass. And then you descend down, and it's only as you enter that the pool unravels and kind of becomes evident. And they wanted a screened-in porch, so we turned the whole living room into a cubic volume that with big sliding doors to create a kind of porch. And then views of this amazing water garden with the biggest bullfrogs you've ever seen, and this kind of idea that the water landscape is as important as the kind of other grasses and landscape beyond. And then here in the distance you can see the St. Lawrence River. So here's this kind of cubic volume, their kind of modernist version of a screened-in porch. And then here you can see the clover meadow late in the season where the clover goes dry, the farmer cuts it down, and then they use all the grasses for the local cows. And then really recently we added a studio and a lap pool to this same complex. So you can see one building from the other, and the lap pool kind of extends this water element and stretches it out into the landscape. The studio is for art. From the desk, you're looking back to the house itself in the distance. And here you can see the kind of new studio and the existing house and their kind of relationship, and a kind of reading of both the kind of site and the context. Our client loves 60s modern sculpture and has been collecting pieces to be part of this landscape for several years. And a very kind of small and very low budget project that we did, which is in an old apple orchard, a 35-year-old apple orchard, a plywood box with a stone extension. And you can see the kind of triangular plywood tower, a stair wrapping around, a local stone wall, and a kind of living and kitchen area. The plywood is both inside and outside, so again, we're always pulling things in and out and trying to create that ambiguity of what is in and out. Again, trying to situate you so this low horizontal building literally becomes part of the orchard, so you actually feel like you're in the orchard when you're looking out your kitchen window. And this kind of sense of this ensemble, this kind of agrarian kind of landscape and these kind of groupings of buildings in them. This is actually a painting by a Canadian painter named Patterson Ewan, and we actually designed a studio for him several years before he died, and he did a whole body of work in it before he passed away. And he was really an inspiration for us because he was very interested in climate and weather and depicting, in effect, the kind of these climatic conditions. And he used plywood. He was called the router guy. So he used plywood and then painted the plywood with alkaline dyes. And if you went to Frank Gehry's new Art Gallery of Ontario, you would see a whole body of his work that is really well displayed there. This project is a kind of wooden tent. It's a kind of a prefab experiment in Georgian Bay. So here's this early sketch. One of the issues is that we had to take, every material had to be transported like the dining hall for the camp, from the city onto a truck, from the truck to the marina, from the marina onto a barge, from the barge onto the site, from the site to the actual building location. So this question of the kind of handling of materials and the lightness of them was actually a criteria that we had to really think about very carefully. A sketch where the kind of idea is it feels like a porch, that it doesn't really feel like a habitable building, but more like a shelter and more like a wooden tent. And here's a kind of study model, trying to understand the light conditions, structure, and the relationship between them. And again, because of this kind of imperative of the delivery and the weight of things and transportation, we actually imagined thinking about it as a prefab, and not in a kind of dwell-like prefab, but actually a series of prefabricated component pieces done in a controlled environment, assembled and then shipped up to the site. So it allowed us a kind of way of working with skilled carpenters in a controlled environment, very little wastage, and then a kind of site assembly, but of pre-assembled pieces. And here's a kind of drawing where the kind of questions of how you hit the Canadian shield and the ways that you actually connect to it, I think were very important to us. Typically, they're heavy concrete footings, and we wanted something that was actually very light and felt that it was not really scarring this ancient rock. We also built a full prototype of one bay of the project, and then we had our structural engineers come and sign off on it. So we kind of did it, we reverse engineered it. We did what we thought would work, and then we got them to look at it. They added a couple things and then said it was okay. So, and then this is how they brought all these pieces onto the site. So it looks a bit like Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, but it's kind of a way of actually bringing all these pieces onto the site. There are issues of the seasonality, the lack of skilled labor, the kind of remoteness of the location that really required a different way of thinking. And then a kind of in process. So these are not finished photographs, but they give you a sense of a corten roof and a kind of, again, a different kind of greenhouse glazing and custom sliders that pull back and transform it into a porch. And a sense of this kind of amazing landscape that is part of the foreground, this group of 7 landscape. And again, these kind of component pieces, frame views of the forest relative to open views of the bigger landscape of the bay. And again, these kind of ways that you read this layered landscape. So the next area of kind of mapping is the Golden Horseshoe. And so Niagara Falls is situated right about here. This is the Niagara Gorge. Niagara on the Lake is here. Buffalo is back here. And Toronto is here. And this area is the economic engine of Canada. It's the largest population. Richard Florida has invented all kinds of names for it that are kind of turning it into a megalopolis. From Oshawa, for him, all the way to Rochester is this kind of a whole new kind of mega city. And in Toronto, we're situated really, in my view, more like this on the north shore of Lake Ontario. So while we're part of this megalopolis, you really see yourself at the edge of one of the Great Lakes. This is a view of Toronto. And when I was in high school, we were asked to do an urban geography project. I ended up talking to people in the planning department, and they thought my project was actually really interesting, but they said, you know, you should talk to this person named Jane Jacobs. And I actually didn't know who she was at the time, and I phoned, they gave me her phone number, and I called her. I told her what my project was, and she said, well, it sounds interesting, but I think you should limit it and you should know your own backyard. So I had this big project in mind, and her idea was, don't make it so big, make it smaller, and by making it smaller, you actually really know everything that you research, and that if it was in your own backyard, it was better than doing something far away. And in a way, it's something that sort of, I then realized how important she was, and what a kind of huge figure she was. And I kind of, took me a while, but I got it. And so I just wanted to share some mapping that I've done with my students at the University of Toronto. We've been looking at laneways in the city. This is a view by a photographer named Arthur Gossman from the late 1800s, and he documented all of Toronto's laneways. They're all in the archives. They're quite amazing, talking about the character of the city. My students did projects looking at laneways, but before that, we actually started to map them. And in a way, like the site that I'm doing for my studio, I'm interested in these sight unseens, these things that are right under our nose, but a little bit invisible, and trying to understand them and understand what their qualities are, and not to eradicate them, but to actually give them a frame or a fuller understanding in our society. So I had my students look at lot division, built form, and to actually start to understand this emerging laneway system in the city. At the same time, we went to the city of Toronto and said, do you know how many laneways there are in the city? And the head of public works said, I don't know. So in the whole city of Toronto, there are about 280 kilometers of laneways, but in the urban core, which is the study area, there are about 120 kilometers. And what you're seeing is only the laneways being drawn. Then with my students, we actually looked at the types of laneways, and we started to give them names. So we have I lanes, Z lanes, T lanes, that they actually start to have frequencies in different areas of the city. So in certain areas, because of the lot division and the way the developers sort of broke up the land, there are longer uninterrupted lanes, where in other parts there are shorter lanes because, again, of the relationship of railway lines and main streets and how the lots were subdivided. And so not only mapping type, but frequency across the city really gave us a kind of new collaging, a kind of remapping of this system, again, that's right under our nose, and a kind of understanding of actually making something invisible more apparent. I wouldn't say more visible, but actually reading it in a way that allows you to understand the potentials and the possibilities of this system itself. So I think, in a way, the kind of question of mapping is something that I'm interested in at many different scales, at the kind of scale of the city and then at the scale of our own work. Very early project, back alley in Toronto, and again, you can see it being hemmed in and only accessible by kind of small laneways. So in terms of scale, we're looking at 17 feet, 45 feet for the built form, and 106 for the actual lot itself. Kind of situated within the pickup trucks and the kind of existing condition, so not trying to change its context, but more insert something surgically into an existing context. And again, this kind of question of the section and the manipulation of the ground plane. And this kind of inside-outside where the line stops, you're not really sure. This question of these kind of small landscapes that have an intensity to them. And this question of seasons, of summer and winter being equally important. So really thinking about our project in the middle of a snowstorm as well as in a kind of verdant summer day, and both being actually part of the thinking and the interest. And then the question of light, a kind of ongoing question for all architects in all places. I think that our latitude is 44, we're at latitude 44, so it has challenges in terms of a northern light, and this kind of question of how to amplify the light through the winter is really something that we continue to explore. So from inside looking out. And the next project is, and we're starting to get these pairs of projects where we did something 10 years ago, and then we come back and do something else on the same site for the same client. So this was a very low budget house, clad in plywood for a client who was an architect, never practiced, became an archivist. And so here you have the kind of upper level and then the lower level. Then we were asked to design a studio right next to the house that we had built. So here you actually see the house we did 10 years ago and then this fairly new studio. And so here you're actually kind of having a dialogue or a conversation with yourself. So it was a kind of one room that was wanting a great deal of light, but no direct light. So we created these light monitors, these light coffers, a very skinny skylight, a variety of depths of wall thickness that dealt with indoor storage, outdoor storage, and lot lines, sort of a whole kind of complex set of competing agendas. Really to create, in effect, a space that's full of light with very little apertures or light coming into it. The above is all in birch and then white drywall down below. And part of it was a viewing for historic architectural photographs and a large collection of architectural posters. So the kind of idea of display was actually very much part of the design program. And this is a kind of complete experiment, and we actually have just finished a synagogue in Portland, Maine, and we actually used a lot of the kind of lessons that we learned from this to help us develop a whole agenda for light. So the next kind of map or kind of frame that I'm going to use are Toronto's ravines. And so here you're seeing the kind of an aerial of the city. So the CN Tower would be here, Mies van der Rohe's Tower is very close by, the university is right here. So the whole central core is located here, the Toronto Islands, the waterfront. And in a way, there's another hidden landscape, which are a series of river valleys that really bracket and frame the downtown. This is called the Don River, and this is the Humber River. And in a way, Toronto Ravines were described by Larry Richards, the former dean of the architecture school, as Toronto being San Francisco turned upside down. So if you imagine that kind of inversion of topography. And in a way, the ravines are also really interesting because many of the major writers, such as Margaret Atwood, Anne Michaels, Robert Fulford, Morley Callahan, Anne-Marie MacDonald, really situate much of their work in the ravines themselves. So Robert Fulford states that the ravines are the chief characteristic of the local terrain, its topographical signature. They are both a tangible, though often hidden, part of our surroundings and a persistent force in our civic imagination. They are the shared subconscious of the municipality, the places where much of the city's literature is born. And for us, this has been the site for many of our projects. So in a way, all of these dots are kind of different projects that we've done at the edge of the ravine itself. In 1954, there was Hurricane Hazel. And you don't think of Toronto as being a hurricane zone, but it was one of those fluke conditions. And many buildings in the ravine, people used to live in the ravines themselves, were destroyed. And a public agency called the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority was formed as a reaction to this natural disaster. And they're responsible for maintaining the ravine as an open space. So as opposed to private land, it becomes, in effect, this public zone. So here are a series of black and white photographs by Stephen Evans, a Toronto photographer, that depict, in effect, some of the qualities of the ravine. There's sometimes up to a 20-meter differential between the top and the bottom of the ravine. So if you go as a tourist to Toronto, you think of it as a flat city. So again, this negative landscape doesn't appear in any tourist brochures. It's never considered a feature. But if you live there as a citizen, it becomes this huge amenity, this bike paths where you can cycle for miles without ever hitting a stoplight. So this kind of slightly, the need to discover it is actually part of its strength. And again, the kind of, here you can see the ravine down below with a roadway, and then the subway continuing, and then the kind of urban fabric of the city. So again, this kind of topography that kind of creeps up on you, because if you were to navigate the city, you might not even be aware of it. And again, a view of the ravine. There's a cross-country skier in the foreground, and then the kind of urban fabric beyond. So a very early project, a kind of small garden pavilion, but in a way the DNA of a lot of continued explorations, retaining walls, a kind of interest in materials, and this kind of intertwining of built form and landscape. For the same client on the same site, a recent pavilion using a kind of profilate glass as a lantern, this kind of ambiguity of in and out, fireplaces that are inside and outside, and a kind of framing of this kind of verdant ravine landscape. So you're looking at black locusts and walnut trees within the, and you're literally in the ravine in this case. And another project called the Weathering Steel House, where in effect the house is clad in weathering steel. And it's a kind of material that we've been interested in using because it reacts to the kind of atmospheric conditions. So again, these things, these atmospheric conditions that are normally unseen are actually registered in relation to the Corten. And so we started off with that first garden pavilion quite a while ago using it. There's a big steel company in Hamilton called Stelco, and we phoned their research department and we said, we really want to use this material. And they said, under no circumstances should you use it. They'd had all these lawsuits with Corten steel that had been improperly detailed, and they had rusted out, and so it got us really interested. And so we asked them for a list of every project that had used Corten steel, and so we went to visit all of them. And we figured out from looking at them how they didn't detail it properly. Why it failed, because they didn't drain it properly, or the gauge was too thin, it had oil can. And so from actually seeing these kind of failures, we actually developed a way of thinking about how to put it together. And so we've learned a lot about the materials really by by just building a kind of experiential understanding of them. So this project is situated in a very suburban neighborhood. We were interested in using the texture of the steel, so there's almost like a kind of bas-relief of these rods with the steel. And then again, sculpting out parts of the front yard. So we love digging and scraping and shifting grade and altering your vantage point. Entering, and we like long slot spaces as well as sort of, and then again, a kind of water landscape with the ravine edge beyond. And this is that same view from the outside looking in. And then sort of these hovering pieces where there's sort of cubic volume. So this is actually a skylight that brings light down into the stairwell. And then views from the ravine edge looking back in winter. And from the inside looking out again in winter. So the project, we didn't realize this until it was built, actually lines up with the CN Tower. So you can actually see it in the winter. And again, this kind of layering of the steel and the wood and this kind of cutting away and the plasticity that we're interested in. So in terms of the ravine, this project is called the Integral House. And for us, at the time that it was built, it was for us a really large project. And we really thought of this as an experimental and speculative project. It really comes out of a conviction and a belief that architectural ideas and materials are inextricably intertwined. Another way to put it is that architecture is a physical substance, and in a way embedded in its conceptualization is the imperative to determine its materials as part of the conceptual act. The project uses computer and manufactured processes to realize its architectural vision. So flat and rotational laser cutting, water jet cutting, casting, 3D printouts, bending, punching. We kind of used everything we could and had lots of fun at the same time to kind of realize a level of craft in the project. We're really fortunate our client is a mathematician focused on calculus, and as well a concert violinist. So curves were part of the program. He said it had to have complex curving volumes, as well as a concert space, a performance space for up to 150 people. So it had this kind of both private program, it's a house, but a very public program embedded in it. So that kind of oscillation, that ambiguity was really interesting for us. Ken Frampton called this the endless house, referring to the seemingly endless yet fluid volumes of space both inside and out. So what I want to do is share with you with this project not only the project but also the process, because I think it gives you a sense of the range of explorations and the types of models and things we do in the studio. So early study models made of cardboard and wood and tracing paper that really look at the kind of volume. So this is from the street where you're looking really at a two-story house. Because it's hugging the edge of the ravine, on the other side it's actually 5 stories. So you get this sectional difference between the kind of urban side and then this wilder ravine side. And so part of the idea was that you felt as if you entered the ravine while never having to go outside. Study models in wood, acoustics were really important to this kind of program. And our client said he didn't want to bring in acousticians too early because they would tell him that it should look like a shoebox. And so what we did is we developed the architecture to a certain point, and then we had acousticians come and we asked them 2 questions. A, do you think it's going to work? And B, how can we make it better? And so they actually gave us some suggestions that helped us. We listened and we modified sort of more minor aspects of it to amplify the sound, but it wasn't driven by acoustics as the primary driver of the project. Early studies of a series of more denser, what we call wooden fins up here, and then kind of opening up to the ravine. So it's almost like a wooden curtain that opens up, and studying in effect the relationship of the denser and less dense aspects. So it's basically a custom curtain wall that we developed by using prototypes, working with glass engineers to create a kind of new system. We used computers. This is a drawing of every single fin at what we call the 400 level, at the denser level. So you're kind of, in a way, we would share these drawings with the fabricators, back and forth, back and forth. Everyone that bid on the fins had to produce a fin so that that became their kind of submission to determine whether they would get the project. And we developed, sort of, it's almost like fitting out dresses, so everyone is numbered and they fit different parts of the fins. And so here are some of those mock-ups where each one is a different submittal by a different fabricator. And then sectional drawings, detailed drawings of, these are the lower fins that were used, which are more standardized. So you're looking at the kind of épée caps on the exterior, the glazing, and then the wooden fin where the frame is actually buried in the actual window section, so you actually don't read a window frame. All you read is light and wood. And here's a full-size mock-up. So again, the glass would actually fit right in here, in between, and these fins are part of the interior, and then this is part of the exterior. We were able to design even the door handles. So you're looking at a sequence from clay all the way through to these, which are 3D printouts. The 3D printouts were used as the kind of mold for the casting. So the kind of, again, positive, negative as you move through it. And the role of the computer really as this amazing tool at every stage of the process. And then we were really fortunate, Ed Burtynsky, who's a really well-known photographer. You might know his China books and his Shipwrecker series and his Oil and Water, but he's a friend and he photographed both the demolition and the construction of the building. He actually had a camera fastened to a tree, covered up to look like a tree house, and it took digital photographs every 10 minutes for 3 years. And he was using it as an experiment because he was working with parts of Shanghai depicting the transformation of neighborhoods. And this was a local experiment to make sure the technology worked. And so we have this amazing 12-minute video of sort of multiple seasons. But we have this kind of amazing memory of the construction of the project. So you can see the vertical slope here of the kind of ravine edge in the distance, and the kind of scale of building in the ravine, the issues of construction that are really needed to be holding back a kind of part of a hillside. And then drawings giving you a sense of the section. And if we were to go to the bottom of the ravine, we would kind of be really off the page. It just is part of the slope. And then the section where you start in at the upper level, so this is the street level, and you descend down to the performance space, which is one full floor below the level of the street. And then the plans from the lowest level, moving up. There's a large green roof here, and ways that these spaces are almost an extension of the existing contour lines. And then we developed with the computers a kind of complete steel template that was used in the formwork. So you're kind of trying to create this curvilinear thing in the middle of space. And this, the precision of the steel template allowed a kind of level of accuracy in the formwork throughout. And then the site. So here you're looking at the brickworks, which is part of the ravine system, the CN Tower, and the building is located on the hillside here. So you're really in the kind of the Don Valley ravine. So this in the distance is the Bloor Viaduct that's part of Michael Ondaatje's In the Skin of the Lion. And it's the kind of linking piece across the valley that allowed for the expansion of the city. A view of it from the kind of ravine side where you're seeing this 5-story building in the ravine itself in winter. From the street side, again, a different scale altogether, where from the early model you can see the kind of two-story building with hidden reflecting pools that only appear when you get close to them, a kind of curving etched glass that's used here with LED lights behind it, so at night it has a kind of slightly liquid quality to it. The entrance, where you're kind of literally almost still part of the city, about to almost enter the ravine. And the kind of part of the program, again, this concerts for 150 of my closest friends. And this sort of sense of the layers of extension. So here you're literally along the contour line. So in a very Victorian city that's really worried about side yards and no fire penetrations, it's this amazing condition of leaving the city and literally being in the ravine. And it's the only reason there was a pre-existing house that grandfathered in this condition that allowed it to be here in the first place. So again, this kind of serpentine path down to the main performance space that almost extends into the paths of the brickworks down below. And a kind of viewing back to the urban part, the kind of rectilinear portion that is the entrance. And the kind of upper level, more domestic spaces like the dining areas actually become balconies during the performance. So it's part of that duality of public and private. And then the main space itself. So you can see the denser wooden fins here and then the more open fins down below. And in winter, this kind of changing light condition. And again, the kind of interest in many of these elements were computer fabricated. So you have upstands of limestone that are curving in two directions. And because of the new technologies, we could take advantage of all of these things. Our client loves glass and asked us to collaborate with a glass artist. And so we worked with Mimi Gelman, and she developed an overall concept, and we worked together to insert this secret blue glass stair into the middle of the project. So it's this kind of series of blue glass shingles with a skylight above it and glass treads below it, so the blue light filters down vertically through the project. There are a series of cast bronze clips that actually support the glass shingles combined with stainless steel cables. And there are parts of the house where you catch glimpses of it, so you're not in it, but you see it from the outside before you get into it. And then here you can see in the upper level not only the curving blue glass, but the bronze clips and the stainless steel cables. And then as you descend further, again, you're kind of at the edge where the stairs, public stairs, are never rectilinear, but always on the outboard or inboard side. So it feels like you're traversing a natural feature. And then at the bottom is a kind of a pool where you're almost in the forest. And a la Tugendhat, there's a kind of 35-foot long window that descends down into the ground. So when you're outside, you're really outside. And then for the kind of opening concert, we designed a series of music stands. And in a way, it's been a really interesting learning experience, seeing everything from contemporary dance performances to more classical voice and piano, to this is the Simon Bolivar Orchestra, a selection from the larger Simon Bolivar group from Ecuador, playing in the space. And then a series of seasonal shots. This is spring, summer, fall, and then winter. So I guess I wanted to conclude the overall talk by moving maybe more outward and reflecting on the word remapping, which was how I titled the talk. and maybe shift a bit to this kind of experience of the Aga Khan jury, a jury where architects, historians, philosophers, artists are around the table having a conversation. And maybe to eavesdrop on that conversation, I just wanted to have an excerpt from the jury report of 2007. In a way, we talked about the idea of scale not merely being a problem internal to architectural knowledge or practice, but the scale of the contemporary Ummah reveals the profound differences in sites and localities, rural communities, small towns, industrial cities, private homes, public institutions that demand imagination and material, practical interventions. Scale is an architectural intervention that responds to site specificity while at the same time creating or constructing a sense of locality. In that sense, scale is an ethical issue. In a way, the jury spent a lot of time talking about sustainability. And we talked about sustainability pits the grandiosity of our ambitions against the available and appropriate scale of natural resources. How high should we build? How suitable are our schemes for this particular landscape, climate, need, or human interest? Sustainability as a scale of aesthetic, ethical, and political judgment creates an architecture that is not just about building or buildings, but about creating an environment for survival and well-being, shared expression, and solidarity. So in a way, this kind of question that we keep asking ourselves about local and issues local are really part of maybe a larger conversation. And what I just wanted to do is share maybe some of the issues that these projects that we looked at really raised for the jury. And this is the Dutch embassy in Addis Ababa, and there was a huge discussion about the intersection of architecture and landscape, architecture and sculpture, the kind of sustainability aspect of these heavy, load-bearing concrete walls, and this kind of leaving a kind of mark of how it's made, this kind of cultural mark at the same time. This is a small garden, a park in Samir Kassir Park in Beirut, designed as a kind of urban refuge. The kind of idea of water and public space actually being intertwined together. A project in Burkina Faso, a central market, where this question of sculptural spaces that are celebratory related to public space where people spend a lot of time. So these are actually self-supporting arches. It's, and again, they built one-to-one prototypes. They use these prototypes to market to retailers, to figure out their material supplies, to actually train masons. So again, these kind of alternate models of working, of thinking about markets not just as buildings, but a piece of public infrastructure. I think talk about the way that local issues actually become maybe broader issues. A tower in Singapore where in a developer-driven culture, the architects were able to think and use new devices. They developed what was called a kind of monsoon window, where during a driving rainstorm you could still get natural ventilation in a tall tower, and developed a whole mechanism to allow that to happen within a much more slick curtain wall system. And so this kind of idea of modernity as well as the vernacular and this kind of questioning of both and the reciprocity between both, I think, is really interesting. For architecture students, the kind of idea that you not only could spend time in a place, but create a project. This is the school in Rudrapur by Anna Henninger, where she, in effect, spent a gap year in this village, just volunteering, not quite knowing what she wanted to be when she grew up. And by volunteering for a year, developed a deep understanding of this local community, and when she went back to architecture school, was able to create a knowledge transfer between her as the designer, but also as someone who understood the community, to create a building that emerges from the place as opposed to being given to the place. So a kind of different role or relationship between the architect. And then in terms of sustainability, they used all local materials, loam, which is kind of straw and clay, beaten up by water buffaloes, and bamboo, using these kind of these layered bamboo with joined together to really create a new school. And in a way, the kind of, for me, the solutions point to, in effect, ways that in-depth knowledge of the local condition can actually maybe be a model for how we think about sustainability, both in our backyard or further away. So this experience got me to thinking about it and mapping. And so what happens is the Aga Khan Awards are 30 years old. They take place every 3 years. And what I did is I mapped the last 3 cycles, locating the place of all the winning projects. So this is 2001, 2004, and then the most recent one is 2007. And you can see their geography being of a certain belt that encompasses the Muslim world, and is fairly predictable, of a certain climate. And the same time, in 1993, I was fortunate to receive a Canada Council grant, and that enabled me to travel to Scandinavia. And so Howard and I spent 8 weeks traveling through Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland. And we were also invited to the 10th Alto Symposium, which took place in Jyväskylä. And in a way, a kind of understanding for me of modernity intertwined with a kind of egalitarian society and nation building was something that I could only maybe understand from actually being there and seeing these sort of communal gatherings. So what I did is I mapped the speakers of the last 3 Alto Symposiums, because it again is 30 years old. It takes place every 3 years, and in a way, in each of the 3 cycles, so here is 2003. This was probably Glenn Murcutt down here, I think. 2006. And then what I think is really interesting for me is 2009, because what started to happen was 2 of the winners of the Aga Khan Award, Francis Carré from Burkina Faso and Anna Henninger, who designed the bamboo school, were both speakers, along with speakers from Thailand, India, and South Africa. And for me, it signals a kind of different conversation, that before it was a northern conversation with a few people from the British Empire, with a kind of other discussion happening in the Muslim world. And I think that what's really interesting is to start to imagine it actually being part of the same conversation, these kind of alternate models for practice. And what I wanted to do was to quote, so here you're seeing the 2 combined. You're actually seeing the kind of new merging of this kind of a different map of the world, where the conversation between the high architecture, quote, and the kind of these other projects are maybe part of the same discussion. And I wanted to quote from an article that Billy Tien wrote as part of the last publication for the Aga Khan, and she spoke about, in talking about the impact of this award, she said, the connection of the award to the larger architectural world is crucial because it speaks of the marriage of high design with ethics. Too often, good intentions are realized in the form of mediocre architecture. There's a general attitude that says that it doesn't have to be so good if it's for a good cause. We must demand that good intentions are expressed by the highest level of design. In this way, the quality of the aspiration can be matched by the quality of the built work. And I guess for me, every student in this room has the capacity to shape and transform the world around them. in profound ways. And I think everyone here is very privileged to be part of a kind of institution that is at the leading edge of architecture. Let's begin by knowing, as Jane Jacobs would say, your own backyard. Let's share the lessons that we've learned with others, and let's build buildings that touch and shapes people's lives in meaningful ways that also demonstrate the profound benefits of exemplary architecture. Thank you very much.
Begin a new year, so it's especially wonderful. I can ask for questions if you'll take a few questions.
Totally happy to, yeah.
We have a little bit of time.
Yeah.
It's our tradition to ask the speakers to respond to questions from the audience. Are there any questions? Yes, there's one up on the balcony.
Hi, thank you. You spoke convincingly of the value to architecture of knowing your own backyard. It seems that we tend to think of architectural education as more of an international thing. As students, we gather from around the world and we do studio projects around the world and then we disperse again. Is that as it should be, in your opinion?
I think that's a very good question. You know, as someone who didn't go to an Ivy League school and went to a public school in Canada because all the architecture schools are public, I'm always struck by the challenge of students in institutions that have a really high tuition. And I think that well, partly the part of it is that the studios you take are kind of, you know, out there, and they're challenging and really exciting. And then the kind of difficulty is that when you have a really high debt load, when you graduate, especially in a discipline like architecture, it's actually harder to take risks. It's harder to kind of do something that is, you know, like some of these projects are kind of like out there projects, because when they started, they didn't know if it would be a project. How am I going to raise the money? So it's a really interesting question, and I think it's the relationship between the amazing opportunities of your education and the range of things that you're exposed to in a school context, and then the kind of need to pay back your debt and how do you survive. It's a challenging contradiction, and it's hard to, it's a tough one, and people have different ways of resolving it. But I would say for, you know, when I went to school, we could take risks when we graduated because we didn't actually have the kind of burden, and it meant you could live more like a student for a long time and experiment with a bunch of projects and see them built and figure out what was going on. And it's I think sometimes harder when you're kind of maybe more, you're exposed to more and you're in the spotlight more, and then you've got to kind of, you don't have as much time to make some mistakes or to learn a bit slower. It's a tricky thing. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think it raises a lot of important issues that you each have to grapple with in your own way.
Thank you. Especially for the bit about tuition. Are there other questions? Apparently there is a question back there. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question about the last point you made in terms of high design, marrying high design with ethics. And the point you made was that you want to match the quality of the aspiration with the quality of good work, which I think is a really critical question. And I'm a landscape architect ecologist, and oftentimes the criteria or the issues that I'm thinking about from an ecological standpoint might take priority over some of the design issues and vice versa. And I'm wondering, when you start thinking about that interplay of a kind of ethical agenda with architectural goals, do you think that you can achieve the kind of architectural dialogue and issues that have been around for the last 50 years in terms of form and aesthetic and materiality, or are those shifting and starting to evolve into another set of kind of architectural agendas? And I ask that partly because, in a way, part of your discussion was about mapping and mapping at different scales and looking for hidden elements of your sites, which starts to suggest to me that maybe by revealing hidden elements, you're starting to relate or expose aesthetic values that may not have been there in the past. And so I'm just curious, can you sort of describe from the architecture today how this interplay is taking place, and whether it's the traditional architecture or is architecture shifting into new arenas in terms of its in terms of what it is you're trying to match and what the agendas are within it? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think you've kind of captured some of the unsaid aspects of the talk. And I think that was interesting today in the option studio lotteries where, Deanna and Joel and Alessandro, there are many of these questions about kind of the environmental component of our buildings in relation to kind of design. And I think that my premise is that they're not mutually exclusive. They are intertwined, but sometimes they take longer, or they don't fall into the more traditional, professional way of realizing architecture, or clients have to have a different timeline, or something's got to adjust in the equation to actually get both to happen at the same time. And I think that we need to, as architects, maybe sometimes push back or design or create these alternate models to actually allow these things not to be mutually exclusive, but to be embedded into the same project. But you can't do it when you're, on a kind of blasting timeline, or kind of, there are other factors that drive the kind of the reasons for architecture being a certain way, and there needs to be some give and take in that equation to actually have these mutual agendas coexist and be synthesized in a project. So I think that we have to be designing the process for those kinds of projects to emerge, as opposed to, expecting them to happen. I think there also is a class of much more educated clients who also believe passionately in kind of issues of sustainability and ecology, and I think that they will also help to create these new buildings. Architects can't do them on their own.
You have one more question down front? Hold on to the mic.
I have a question.
Wait.
I know you think a lot and are very involved with the city of Toronto, because I've come up and visited you, and I've been lucky enough to go through a number of your projects too. The work you showed today, you didn't actually show the park project, which I was surprised, which to me is the real civic project. And most of the houses are single occupants sometimes, or single owners, and inward turn when they're in the city.
And
they turn inward in the city and turn outward at nature. And I'm curious where your practice is at now, given the extraordinary things that you've done, whether projects of larger scale that are reflective of the pressures in Toronto right now, which you're involved in, would be of interest of you, or whether you are choosing at this point in your career to stay in this zone of work that you've been doing for the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
Would you take on a tall building or some of the things that you're looking at?
Did everyone hear the question? Yeah, okay. I think we're actually doing probably the biggest project we've ever done, which is a private hospital, assisted living, and a chapel for a group of Catholic nuns. And it's, for us, a really large project in scale. It's actually on the other side of the ravine from the Integral House, so you can actually see one from the other. So it's this kind of ravine site. It actually has it'll probably be the greenest building of its type in Toronto when it's done, with geothermal, solar hot water preheat, cross ventilation. And we've been working with them for about 4 years. So it's a very complicated municipal approval process. So in a way, it'll be interesting to see how it turns out, because in a way we've embedded a lot of the ethical issues with a client who actually wants a building that when they're no longer living will speak to who they are. So it has a kind of fairly heavy component to it. And I think that what we did at the beginning of that process was we actually had seminars for them. We created seminars where we had all the experts in sustainability come and talk to them. We educated them about what the issues are so they could be, in effect, an educated client in the process. And I think that for us that was a way of, in effect, us thinking about how to design the process to actually achieve the right results that had in it, you know, the different issues that we're trying to intertwine. So it's and I think that we are really interested in different scales of buildings, and we just take a bit longer than most people to get there. Just like we're not fast, we're slow, but you know, it's just how we work.
Slow architecture like slow food.